Welcome to Endocrine and Cell Communications, Part 1. Today we will look at a brief introduction to the process of communication and why it's so important to cells. So if you think about the question, how does a cell communicate? What might you say? He uses a cell phone. Art, 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 art. Well, actually, we will get a little more in depth than that in our study of cells and how they communicate. It's a fairly significant portion of your curriculum in AP Biology. You should be able to identify some very specific examples of how cell communication is used in different systems and for different purposes. You can see that you also need to be able to explain how cells communicate down to the level where you can tell how they generate a signal, how they transmit a signal, and how they receive a signal. So that will be the bulk of our focus in this unit as we go through cell communication. That process of cell communication has been a shared feature. It also reflects evolutionary history because we have single-celled organisms that can communicate intra and extracellularly, as well as multicellular organisms that are able to communicate very complex messages from one part of the organism to another. So let's think for a moment, why do cells need to communicate? What is it that a cell has to tell some other cell in its body? Take a moment to think about that and write a few examples down. Why do cells have to communicate? There are a lot of reasons. Here are a few. You may have recorded some of these in one form or another. One of the things that cells have to be able to do is to coordinate their activities from one cell to another. So they need to be able to coordinate activities so that, for example, when one part of the body needs nutrient or is trying to grow or whatever, that cell receives the information that it needs or the nutrients that it needs. So here are just a few reasons. Cells need to be able to coordinate activities inside the actual multicellular organism. We also will look at hormones and how they are used and what their actions are. Cells need to know where they belong and into which group they belong. Single-celled organisms like yeast cells, for example, use cell-to-cell communication to find a mating cell. We'll see that cell communication is important in biochemical pathways. It's also important in expression of genes. There are a lot of biochemical pathways that cells need to communicate in order to regulate them. And in addition to that, communication of what cells need to be done away with, or the process of cell death, and then of course cell generation also needs to be communicated. So there are a lot of needs or different venues for cell communication in the body. So we're going to look at some very specific ones. When we consider the ties all the way back, as I mentioned, all the way back to those cells that are archaebacteria, eubacteria, up to multicellular organisms, we'll see examples of cell communication. And the relatedness of the pathways that they choose for communication is evidence of the evolutionary lines and relatedness between the organisms that share those specific communication pathways. One of the examples that we will look at, or one of the methods that we'll look at in this unit, is called signal transduction. And it's a really clear and clean example of how cells communicate and cells that are related to each other, given the pathway of communication that they use. We're going to look at an animation of this process that I mentioned of signal transduction. So if we start here, let me orient you to this picture. Here, this orange is an example of a cell membrane, and we'll see this little icon here is to represent an embedded protein, and those are really important as we look at this process of signal transduction. So when we consider just the basic idea of how do you respond when you see, let's say, an angry bear, well, you are going to try to avoid that through the fight or flight response, and more likely you're going to flight or flee, and your muscles need to react. Now, they don't receive any visual stimulus. This muscle doesn't know that there's a bear around. And so there has to be input, in this case, a visual cue that, oh, there's a bear, he's angry. And the communication occurs in your body that allows a signal, a reaction signal, to be sent to and developed then into an actual action inside your muscle cell. So our bodies have a variety of needs for communicating. So when we consider cell communications that involve biochemical signals, if we look at this pathway, we'll see an effector hormone releases a signal. That signal binds with a receptor, and then that receptor causes a reaction inside the cell. That reaction could be that it causes a protein to be produced. Notice that the signal ends up being processed and interacting with the DNA, producing a protein, and then that protein could alter a function. Or in the case of our bear, it may be that the signal interacts and produces a response that's going to stay inside the cell and cause that cell, in this case, to react to produce more available glucose so that it could contract and help us to escape being eaten by the bear. So hormones become really important in a signal transduction pathway. You'll notice an endocrine gland here in the upper right is producing a hormone, and that hormone then is traveling through the bloodstream, entering into a target cell, and then it would cause some specific example. So we will, in this unit, look at some very specific examples of hormones. Here are just a few that you might see as we go through. There's epinephrine, which is like we just used with our bear example, would cause muscle contraction, eventually cause muscle contraction. Another hormone we'll look at as we go through would be insulin. It's related to glucose use and metabolism. Vasopressin regulates our blood pressure. Glucagon is related to the action of insulin. They are sort of counteracting one another, and it helps mobilize fatty acids. Growth hormone is another example of a communication pathway when we look at the secretion of a growth hormone. And then interleukin 2 would be another example. And so through the tracking of hormones, if we were to watch a hormone in this pathway, most of the hormones are unable to enter or cross through the membrane of their cell. So in order for the hormone to have an action inside a cell, you'll notice that it binds with an embedded integral protein, and then that protein is going to set off a reaction inside the cell, and is going to involve the cell membrane in that pathway. So not all hormones work exactly the same. Some of them might enter into the cell and cause a chain reaction of sorts to be set off, because once it enters, then it may activate a protein, which activates an enzyme, which activates, and we would call that a cascade. So a hormone sometimes will set off an intercellular cascade, and then we get an amplification of the signal inside. But either way, the process of communicating inside the cell is really important. Not all communication occurs, though, inside the cell. We will look at inside the cell and outside the cell communications as well. Outside chemicals that are secreted to the outside of the cell include pheromones. You may have heard of those. Even simple bacteria go through a process of extracellular communication where they can send signals out to their environment and cause a sensing or a response with neighboring cells. We'll, of course, look at a lot of inside the body reactions as well, both short distance and long distance communication. So with the short distance communication, probably one of the most classic examples would be pheromones. So pheromones are communicating signals that involve the same species. So dog to dog, or ant to ant, bee to bee. would be chemicals that members of the same species can detect, and those are in the environment, and that's how they are detected. They're secreted by one organism and detected by a second organism. So we'll see them involved in pathways like helping to identify food or some nutrient source, also marking territories, warning other species members of predators, and then also very actively involved in the process of attracting mates. We're going to look at an example of um, termites following pheromones at this link. So there's a little short video I want you to see here. I'll enlarge
so what we're about to do, you're going to need three things: a plain blank white sheet of paper and a Papermate pen. It's very important it is a Papermate brand pen because other types of ink will not work for this. And what you want to do is draw a trail, just any kind of curving, winding trail, something like that. And the third thing you're going to need might be a bit hard to find, but you might have access to them: a termite or several termites. And here we have a tank with a few. And what you're about to see is pretty interesting. If I shake one termite onto there, we'll give it a few seconds. Now you can see that the termite stays on the trail, and it may pace back and forth, but it generally keeps right on it and may follow it to the end. And this is because the scent in Papermate pens is almost identical to termite pheromone. So this termite is trying to detect another termite get back to the colony by following the ink trail. And they'll do this 5 or 6 times, pace back and forth. By the time the ink dries out, they'll usually give up and head off, but it will stay there following it for quite some time.
All right, so we see a pretty interesting example of how organisms can detect chemical signals in their environment. So in this case, the example we just watched, the pheromone was being mimicked by the ink in that pen, and then the organism, in this case the termite, was able to detect it and track it as though it were a pheromone that was leading it perhaps to a food source or to a potential mate. So pheromones are secreted to the outside of the organism and then detected by a second organism. With bacteria, there's a process called quorum sensing, and it allows bacteria to monitor the environment for other bacteria and then to alter behavior on a population-wide scale in response to changes in the number or in the number of the species that are present in the community. And so even organisms as simple as a bacteria have the capacity to communicate. So those were both outside the body examples. Let's now turn our attention to some examples that are inside the body. When we look at inside our body, we could have short distance communication, or we might have long distance communication occurring where we send a signal for a fairly long way from one part of the body to the other. The short distance communication is going to typically communicate with cells in that specific area, whether it's very close in that area or, as with an autocrine signaling, the exact same kind of cell that is doing the secretion. So chemical communication could be, first of all, we mentioned outside the body, extracellular, or even extraorganismic. And then in this case, we're going to look at communication inside the body. So this flow chart just shows you a simplified classification system for cell communication that's going to occur inside the body. So let's look at what our curriculum framework tells us we need to know. If we start here with A, we need to know that cells communicate cell to cell by direct contact. So that's one way you need to listen for and be able to give an example of how cells communicate by touching. There's also short distance communication, typically involving a local regulator that has target cells right in that same area where the cells that is doing the secreting is located. And then a third kind of communication when we consider distance traveled would be traveling over long distance. And you also need to have a very clean and clear example in your head of what long distance communication might look like in a cell. And so as we go through these next few examples, listen for examples of how cells communicate by contact, by short distances, or even over long distance. Let's start with direct contact. When we consider plant cells, they have these connecting points that are called plasmodesmata. You can see them throughout here. Here's one cell touching another cell touching a third cell. So here we have a connecting point between three cells. This big light blue space here is the central vacuole. Then you can see the cell wall, a nucleus, a chloroplast, and such. But one cell can communicate with the other by sending the chemical signal through an opening, directly through the opening that already exists, and that opening is called a plasmodesmata. So plant cells have a fairly direct means of communicating built into their cell walls. A second example of communication would be the short distance communication. We see that occurring in a process called paracrine signaling. For example, if you think back to the neurons, you probably wrote this example down earlier when I asked you to give examples of how cells could communicate, because neurotransmitters are a fairly common example, fairly easy for you to remember. Neurotransmitters that are released from one neuron to the other at the synapse, where one cell releases and then the neurotransmitter or the chemical goes to the next cell and causes a response, would be one example of a short distance communication. Here we see an example of paracrine signaling, where a cell is releasing a chemical signal in the vicinity of other cells and then they're going to respond. So that might occur with prostaglandins, where you have an injury and the cells in that area have a joint response, might swell, get red, have that inflamed response in a local area, and prostaglandins are typical chemical signalers in that process. And as I was mentioning, the neurons, when a neuron releases chemicals at the synapse, notice these aren't touching like we saw with the plant cell and the plasmodesmata. Instead, there's a gap. So we have one cell communicating with a second cell by releasing a chemical into the shared environment. So in this case, synaptic signaling is an example of a short distance communication that's occurring inside the body, but over a very short distance, where one cell, in this case the neuron, is releasing the signal. Now you could have a neurosecretory cell releasing a signal into the bloodstream and getting a little bit farther. So you have to be careful with when we classify signaling based on distance, because those lines sometimes are kind of blurred depending on the specific example that you're looking at. But basically we need to know different ways that cells can communicate with one another, and how they breach the gap or the distance. So let's look at autocrine signaling. You need to be able to give an example, for example, of autocrine signaling, where auto means self, and so a cell is signaling either its own self or cells that are just like it. Interleukin 1, for example, produced by monocytes, actually binds to the same cell that secreted it. and thereby causes a response. And then tumor cells, they'll reproduce uncontrollably because they are self-stimulating that signal to divide. So that's another example of how a cell can communicate with itself by the chemicals that it secretes. We're going to see long distance communication occurring typically by endocrine hormones. And these hormones usually travel and have a signal transduction pathway that they follow. Now, the endocrine hormones are typically going to be produced by a gland. Some of them are produced by a cell, but the chemical then travels to another cell, sometimes quite a distance away, and then causes a reaction in the second or the receiving cell. So that pathway of accepting the message, doing something with the message, and responding is called the signal transduction pathway. If you follow this numbered sequence here, the first thing that happens is the cell receives the signal. So if this was, let's say, testosterone, and it came to a cell, could be a hair follicle cell, let's say in the lip of a man, that signal is going to be picked up by an embedded integral protein that has this receptor site that matches. So we call that process reception. Once reception has occurred, then we get the transduction of the signal. Notice that the receptor and the signal molecules stay in place. They don't actually enter the cell, but the transfer of the information occurs through the signal transduction pathway. We see a change in this cellular component, which is typically a protein. It changes shape, and the shape change then is going to ultimately result in a response. So the basic components of the signal transduction pathway would be first reception of the signal, transduction, which is like a translation of the signal, and then some sort of cellular response is going to occur in the classic signal transduction pathway without the signal having to even enter. Now, sometimes the signal molecule will enter, but it doesn't have to enter the cell that is its target cell. So we can get communication from, let's say, testicular tissue all the way to a hair follicle in a cheek cell or a chin cell, because the signal molecule is transmitted through transported through the bloodstream and carried to a different part of the body where it can find a signal cell. So hormones become very specific examples of signal molecules that we'll refer to as ligands, and these hormones, typically produced by endocrine glands, they could be produced by endocrine cells, but those endocrine glands produce the hormones. And they're important communicators, and you'll recognize them because they are chemical signals, and hormones are chemicals that are transported in tissue fluids like the bloodstream, and they are detected only by their target cells. So together, these characteristics or traits make a chemical be called a hormone because they are produced by an endocrine gland, they act as signals, they're transported in the tissues, and they have a target cell. That's really important. You have a lot of things being transported in tissue cells or transported in, for example, the bloodstream that aren't hormones. And so being recognized by target cells is a significant characteristic of a chemical that we would identify as a hormone. So in this case, the red dots in this picture are examples of hormones being secreted by a cell, transported by the bloodstream, and then they have target cells that have receptors that match. So these little cells with the round receptors would be target cells, where these with the more sharp angular receptors would not respond to the presence of this hormone. We'll look a little bit at the different kinds of glands that produce the hormones. The major ones would include our hypothalamus. There are several in the brain region: the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the pituitary gland. Then here in the throat and chest area, you'll see the thyroid, parathyroid. Those work together. A lot of times they are involved in a similar pathway. Then we have the adrenal gland, sits atop the kidneys. We'll investigate that a little more, as well as the pancreas, our reproductive glands, the ovaries and the testes, and look at how they serve as long-distance communicators by secreting hormones. Then there are cells in the heart and the liver and the stomach and the kidneys that also will produce signaling chemicals or hormones. So they are actively involved in that long-distance communication. So to practice what we've done till now, you should have a set of cards made from this information. And I'd like for you to group the cards into long distance, short distance, inside the body, and outside the body signaling. Make a graphic organizer that shows the relatedness of these terms that we've used so far. There are some specific examples, but use those examples as you build a graphic organizer to show your understanding of the different levels of communication. So you'll want to stop the video now and practice that for a moment. All right, welcome back. Does your arrangement look like this? It doesn't have to lay out exactly like this. It could go any direction. But generally speaking, we had talked about communication that can occur inside the cell or outside. So inside the cell or inside the organism, and then outside. Remember, we mentioned pheromones, which were chemicals used between one organism and another. And then we gave the example of quorum sensing with bacteria. So all of these were outside the body examples. Those that remain are inside the body, and there were 3 different levels of distance in communication. That's just one way to look at the cell communication, is by how far away the cells are that are talking to each other. So there was direct contact, short distance signaling, and long distance signaling. Our direct contact example in the PowerPoint was plasmodesmata. You could have also used gap junctions as an example. Plasmodesmata are the ports between plant cells. Gap junctions would be found more likely in animal cells. With short distance, we had 2 pathways here. There's autocrine, where the cell that is secreting the chemical is actually talking to itself or members of the exact same cell line, and interleukin was our example. Then with paracrine signaling, this is short distance communication where the chemical signal is put into the tissue right outside the cell, and communication occurs. And we looked at 2 examples. One was a neurotransmitter going across a synaptic cleft between one neuron and another. Or we looked at paracrine signaling that involved prostaglandin, and prostaglandin was a chemical that's secreted in an area like where you have an injury, and at the site of that injury, those signals, the paracrine signals, work in cells that are near the secreting cells and cause a response to the presence of an injury. And so that's one way you could have arranged your cards. Of course, you may have another way. As long as you can explain accurately the arrangement and why you put it in that order, that's certainly acceptable. You need to be able to talk about how cells communicate using this language. You need to be able to write and speak about secreting cells, the cell that's doing the secretion. So with our testosterone example, this would have been a cell in the testes that's secreting testosterone. We can refer to any cell that's producing the signal as the secreting cell. The actual chemical that is being sent as the messenger, that chemical is referred to as a ligand. So in the testosterone example, the actual chemical testosterone was the ligand. Then the cell that is the target has to have some sort of receptor. The receptor can be in the cell membrane. Sometimes, though, it can even be inside the cell. It doesn't have to be, the receptor doesn't have to be on the cell membrane. It could actually be inside, as is the case with testosterone, where the testosterone actually enters into the cell and binds with its receptor intracellularly, and then together they go into the nucleus. But we'll get to that more later. So the secreting cell is the one producing the signal. The signal can be referred to as a ligand. That ligand has a receptor, or sometimes multiple receptors, in the cell line. And the ligand temporarily binds with the receptor, forms what's called a receptor-ligand complex on or in the target cell. That's the cell that is going to respond to this particular signal or this particular communication chemical. So those are terms that you need to be able to write about, to discuss, and have a clear example in your head in this classic signal transduction kind of pathway of how a cell can communicate with another. So let's look at this specific example. Take a moment to read about insulin here. All right, this says insulin is secreted by beta cells of the pancreas. Once secreted, insulin travels around the body. When insulin docks with an integral protein on the membrane of a muscle cell, glucose can enter the cell. So that's our real-life example. Let's see if you can use those terms and identify each of those terms in this very specific example with insulin. So what is our secreting cell? That would be the cell that is actually producing the insulin. So it says here that insulin is secreted by beta cells of the pancreas. So those are our secreting cells. How about the target cell? Where's our insulin going? In this case, it's going to a muscle cell. Insulin actually has a variety of target cells in the body, but in this specific example, the target cell is a muscle cell. The ligand in this case, you have to think about what was a ligand. The ligand in this case is the actual signal, or the chemical, the hormone, and in this case it's going to be insulin. And then what is our receptor? Which part of this cell is acting as a receptor? And here we have, says it docks with an integral protein. So the key word here was docks. It tells us, this statement told us where the insulin was binding. It was binding with an integral protein on the membrane of the muscle cell. So our receptor is that integral protein on a muscle cell. And so that's how you might see at the application level an example of these terms used in context. You should be able to recognize all four of those in a specific example. The next time we'll look at the actual system, the endocrine system, that produces these hormones and the cells that produce these hormones, as we look more closely at the signal transduction pathway used by our cells for cell communication. See you next time.